Okay, good evening. Welcome to trustees, public stakeholder representatives. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And first, it's with great respect and humility that we acknowledge and honor the lands of the Snuneymuxw people. And the Snuneymuxw people remain their profound, unique, and spiritual connection to the land through their ageless traditions, teachings, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. I'd also like to add that I am here from my home, which is on the Snuneymuxw lands, and appreciating the beautiful nature that surrounds me, the trees, the mountains behind me, and the view of the oceans and the traditional lands. We also know that a number of our participants are joining from Stipmanis nations. So again, welcome everyone. You should have received the agenda, and I'll now ask if there are any additions to the agenda. I would simply like to add one friendly agenda item, which is to the social medias have informed me that it is Trustee Robinson's birthday today, so I'd like to wish a happy birthday to Trustee Robinson. So seeing no additions to the agenda, I'll move on to deletions to the agenda. Seeing no deletions to the agenda, any change in order to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, I will now ask for an approval of the agenda. Motion to approve the agenda by Trustee Lisa Marie Barron, seconded by Trustee Keller. Thank you. All those in favor, and I'll just note that as we move forward throughout the meeting, if I don't hear any or see any objections, I will consider there are none opposed. So all those in favor of approval of the agenda? All those opposed? Okay, thank you. Passed. The next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. We have in front of us the minutes from the March 4th meeting, 2020. I'll ask for a motion to approve. Trustee Brezovich has moved the motion. And Trustee McKay has seconded that motion. All those in favor of the minutes before us? All those opposed? Seeing none, the minutes for the March 4th meeting are passed. We will now move into agenda item number 7, which is presentations. And I just pause quickly before we start that process. I think some of us are still grappling a bit with the new technologies and live meetings via the computer. So just to note, for those of us joining from the public, there is a Q&A section, a chat that you can add questions to. And for those, the trustees will be able to indicate where they have a question as well throughout the presentations tonight. So, and sorry, we don't actually have presentations, but reports. Senior staff reports, which is item 8 on the agenda. And so I will now hand over to our Secretary Treasurer, Mark Walsh, to give us an update on COVID-19 operational response.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. So am I in the frame now? It looks like I am. So we felt it was important from the ops side to present a little bit of information on how we're responding and adapting to COVID-19 for trustees. So in the education meeting a week ago, a lot of the really wonderful work that folks are doing to serve our kids and to maintain safety when they are serving those kids as staff and students But this week is a little bit more focused just to give you an outline of what's happening, of how COVID's impacting operations. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just do want to highlight again the safety precautions that folks are taking to be safe. Obviously, Facilities and Grounds is doing some amazing work right now, supporting our LCCs, but also having staff reallocated to make sure that they have meaningful work, including doing, maintenance and grass work, etc. So just again, it's there for your information. Finance and Payroll, I do want to highlight they're working just as hard as they ever have, just happen to be from home for the most part. And one opportunity that we've actually had during COVID is to start the discussion of a cashless system for our schools. And so particularly given COVID, we want as much touchless as we can, even when we come back to relative normality when it comes. So hopefully we'll be looking at rolling that out sometime in the fall or winter of next year, and we'll have Associate Secretary Hambley come give us a report, I think, on the progress and what that's going to look like. But we're really excited that it's moving. Finally, just again on technology, our IT department has been running. You heard about how technology is serving our kids. But again, just the people and the actions and how they're staying safe, serving students and adults. And then finally, this is also the opportunity that we've had to try to kick our IT plan into overdrive a little bit. So you recall the board has invested significant money in expanding Wi-Fi capacity in our schools to support 21st century learning. And so, in fact, we anticipate that we'll have another electrician hired very soon, hopefully this week, maybe next, to focus solely on that project to get it moving. And when we talk about the budget, we'll hear there is a lot of student demand for that Wi-Fi project, and we want to get it going a little bit faster. So IT and facilities are moving apace on that. So subject to questions, I just wanted to give a brief update. You are muted, Chair.
I'm muted. Thank you for that, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, and thank you to all the staff, on the ground who are making this work. I appreciate this update. I don't see any questions or comments related to this topic. I'll give it a second. No, okay. So we'll move on to item 8.2 on the agenda, which is, again, yourself, and that's regarding the accessibility audit.
Great, and I believe, Mr. Hackwood, are you present as well? Shall see. Okay. So again, the background, we're trying to make our memos as fulsome as possible, so your questions are answered in advance. But the board passed the motion asking staff to provide information on the feasibility of conducting an accessibility audit of facilities. And so when I saw this, I was pretty excited, to be honest, because I think that every organization, it's a good idea to have an accessibility audit to make sure we know where our gaps are and make sure that we're taking those opportunities to fill them at strategic times. So as a background, so staff in the interim have done a few things. They've reached out to third parties to see the costs and what an audit would look like. Talked to a few other school districts about what their experience with accessibility audits, and then also discussed internally whether it would be more prudent and useful for us to conduct the audit ourselves. So I did want to, though, recognize in the discussion, and it's there for you to see, though, that we do a lot of work on accessibility on a year-to-year basis, but predominantly it's a response mechanism. So we have a student or we have an adult that has a specific accessibility need in our school, and so we respond to it at that time. And so we feel that having an audit and being aware of where our gaps are means that we can be just a little bit more proactive as we plan for annual facilities grant, as we plan to upgrade schools during seismic or expansion, that we've got our eyes on the accessibility issues that a school may have. You will see we are not recommending that we proceed to an external auditor for this purpose, not just because of cost though, and cost is one of the factors that's led to the recommendation we're making, but the other is because we think that if we do it internally, there's going to be more buy-in, and that the document itself will be a living document, that every time we have an AFG meeting, we expect the trustees to be asking, well, okay, what did the accessibility audit feed into that AFG staff? And our actual schools, you'll see what we're hoping for is the assistance of principals and custodial to be able to actually input into the report. So you will see on page 11 and 12 of the report, sorry, 11 to 14, what we have in mind for the audit. And so Karen's just bringing that up right now. Essentially what it looks like is a red, yellow, green report that I think that this board is relatively used to. And it's got a variety of accessibility issues in our building and where we are at and where we are lacking. And so we took a school, we haven't done a ton of work yet, but we took a school, Bayview, and we said, okay, let's run it through this and see what it would look like. And so if Bayview ever needed seismic, or Bayview ever needed to have a new floor, or Bayview ever needed some kind of upgrade, we'd take this report and go, this is an excellent opportunity. So we're not going to have to come back in 2 years and address these issues to update our school from an accessibility perspective. And it won't be in reaction to a new student coming, it'll be taking that opportunity. So for instance, if we do end up getting that approval for Solaire and Pleasant Valley, you would expect that we would do this procedure and hopefully, fit the capital spending into this particular upgrades. Then the intention would be, of course, is if this is done, we would post it in a publicly accessible manner so folks can see what the results look like. And so that's why, again, we are recommending what we're recommending. So now, shall I just directly answer the questions or allow the trustees to ask them?
Well, I can read out the questions, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, and then perhaps you can respond, or another that's been working on this with you. The first question comes from Trustee Brezovich. How will we get input from people's actual families with disabilities? And as Trustee has noted, she'll need a follow-up.
Sure. So we haven't gone too deep into this because, of course, we don't have the direction which way we're going to go yet. But we do anticipate that this would be going to schools. So theoretically, it could have the input of the PAC. It could have the input of staff in addition to the principal and to other custodial that kind of know the plant really well. So there's certainly opportunities for that. We haven't contemplated what a public consultation process would look like. Certainly if directed, so we could do that, but we haven't contemplated that at this time.
Okay, thank you. And Trustee, does that answer your question, or would you like a follow-up?
I'd like to follow up a little bit, and I think the problem is, for example, I look at some of these the things on this list, and admittedly, it could be that things have changed since I've been to Bayview. There was a time when I went to Bayview and I couldn't go in through the front entrance, the main entrance that everyone else uses. So to me, we need to be really careful that what we think, what a person who doesn't have a disability considers to be accessible may not be the same for a person who uses a wheelchair or has sight issues or hearing issues. Accessibility involves a whole lot of things. So if we're not getting input from people who actually are experiencing some of these disabilities, then we're not getting a full picture. So that's my comment and sort of follow-up comment there.
So certainly appreciate the comment, and again, barring that conversation within the schools, we haven't really contemplated going to external groups, but certainly there'd be no issue with putting the template that we have through local accessibility groups. That would probably serve us very well. I'd be happy to commit to that.
Okay, I think that's a good segue into Trustee Stanley's question. What expertise do we have to do a knowledgeable accessibility assessment? Do we have anyone through, I believe, through lived experience providing insight?
And so again, with respect to the lived experience, so that answer would be no, that have created this document. Again, is Mr. Hackwood on? I saw his name earlier. No.
I hear something.
Oh. Okay.
If Mr. Hackwood wants to, figures out the that can speak at another point, we'll allow for that. But carry on, Mark.
Yeah, and so what I understand is we would be aiming for our facilities to be up to the modern building codes with respect to accessibility, and so that would be the basis of our planning.
Thank you. We have another trustee. Okay, I see Trustee Stanley has a follow-up. Trustee Stanley?
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you for that. So my comments are very similar to Trustee Berzovich's, and fundamentally, I want to make sure that we get. This is important, and I'm glad that we're no longer requiring students to motivate these changes, because that's not exceptionally welcoming. So I'm glad to hear that. But I do think from doing this accessibility assessment, it's really important to get it from someone who actually, has experience in challenges in accessibility. I want to make sure that we're not just relying, for example, on a sighted person to do assessment on someone with visibility challenges, just because you just don't have the experience to know the actual practical realities versus the on paper challenges. So you mentioned about maybe seeking some external input. Maybe we can get volunteers. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I would really like that we would get someone or a group that can give us actual, from their own personal perspectives, experience about the challenges that they face in public buildings. Thanks.
Okay, I don't know that there was a response needed there. I'm going to move to Trustee Keller's question. How would the findings be implemented, and could they be included in our long-range facilities plan?
So on that front, so how would they be implemented? So the idea would be is that if the board gives direction that what you see with respect to Bayview would be done for all of our schools over the next number of months. So probably by the winter, I think is what we're proposing. And then what that then does is it does feed into our planning from an AFG perspective. And so what that means is you'll see when we go through the budget in a moment, AFG does have money for accessibility. Most of the time, again, that's reactive. But if we know we have these deficits, that's one area. Second one, as I noted, if we're going to have a seismic or we're going to upgrade a school or add to a school, then those are the opportunities that you're kind of using, you're leveraging your money in a strategic way to be able to do those upgrades, because obviously you just can't do them all at one time. So that's how it would go into the overall planning. I certainly would think that it would be something that's contemplated in the long-range facilities plan. Like if the recommendation is that the issues of accessibility are considered whenever the school district is spending a major amount of capital, then that obviously gives the staff marching orders to do so. I think the audit report on its own would do that to a certain extent, but I certainly see that it's totally appropriate to be considered in the long-range facilities plan.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to, I see Trustee Keller has a follow-up to that.
Thank you. I appreciate the response. And I'm glad to hear there's an opportunity to potentially include the results in the long-range facilities plan. And I guess maybe more of a comment than a question, my apologies, is just I'd like to see us do that for the purpose of transparency and just providing the information so that it's clear. People don't have to go digging through different reports to find information about our schools. Thank you.
And thank you, Vice Chair. I'm glad you were able to make it on through the audio here. So I just want to also add in here, I'm seeing that Mr. Hackwood isn't on this evening, so we won't be hearing from Mr. Hackwood at this point. I have another question from Trustee Barron. When looking at the options of working with external organizations, were there various options for this work to be conducted? For example, are there options for ongoing consultation with the external organizations, or is there only one option for a flat fee? Can we be creative on how we use external supports for steps to move forward?
So what I can say is that when we went to the Rick Hansen Foundation, they sent us to a consultant, for instance, who provided an overview of their services. So I would have to get back to the board on the issue of what the ongoing consultation could look like and if that would be part of the services. As far as I'm aware right now, it is not, but I will have to look into that issue.
Okay. And I see that Trustee Brezovich has a follow-up.
Thank you. It's sort of, and you have to forgive me, please, Mr. Walsh, because it's somewhere between a comment and a question. I'm not sure how to word it. So we can work through this together. Do we have, what would we as a board do if we wanted to make sure that we've set standards, for example, of, to me, a building is not accessible if a person cannot physically, and I'll give you an example, cannot physically get in the front door that everyone else uses. We have at least 2 schools that pop into my head where I have to go in through a weird entrance, have to phone ahead to get someone to let me in, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm wondering is, can we would that be a policy? Would that be a, to sort of say that our goal would be to eventually address those issues? And that we don't consider a building fully accessible until a person can get in the same front door that everybody else uses. Do you know what I mean? Am I making any sense?
I do, and I would suggest that typically that's probably more of a board policy direction than necessarily part of the audit. So I don't think we were necessarily envisioning what you suggested there, Trustee, and so I think that's probably more of a policy question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sitting here thinking on some of the questions I have. Trustee Higginson has put, how does staff feel about creating an advisory committee of local experts who can provide us with insight into designing our own accessibility audit document?
So I guess, again, perhaps from a policy statement perspective, it may be suitable. I would worry about adding too much to the plates of facilities. Like, it's almost like we may need additional facility staff to be able to to stick handle that group. I'd really want to talk to the facilities department to see where their capacity is at before I could really respond. I know they're feeling pretty pressured right now with a variety of projects. So that would be the caution about having an ongoing group for that purpose. But again, an advisory committee to come up with some statements maybe or some basic principles, then complete its work and then have us go do our work may be a doable plan. I just worry maybe about the ongoing nature of it.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just indulging in the chat here myself. Okay. There was a follow-up, Trustee Higginson, to that?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I guess my follow-up is, you know, what I'm hearing right now is, and seeing as well, as a little bit of, we need more eyes on the document before I feel comfortable in terms of, you know, the points that Trustee Stanley and Trustee Berzovich were making. And so I'm not looking to add, you know, more to staff's plate. What I'm looking for is to kind of put a layer in there where before the document becomes the one that's used, it's put through a filter of a group of local experts who say, yes, this document is one that will fulfill the needs that you're looking for. And so and I understand that perhaps you'll need to go back and ask the facility staff, is that something that they're willing to do? But I just, at this point, I'm still struggling with being in favor of the recommendation, knowing that we do seem to have a bit of a gap in us producing our own accessibility review documents.
Okay. Trustee McKay's question is, could staff fulfill the work as shown in the recommendation and follow up with the consultant reviewing our internal work with final recommendations?
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay. So I do not see any further questions. And I believe Trustee Keller, Vice Chair Keller, did you want to ask a question?
Thank you to Trustee O'Neill. Sorry, I was trying to type and I didn't want to miss out. So thanks for catching my half question there. So my question is to Mark, Mr. Walsh, is there any potential value in at least including someone with expertise in accessibility in the review to perhaps add a layer of professional oversight that may help us in accessing funding for some of the improvements at a later date? So in other words, would it make us more likely to be eligible or receive funding to make accessibility improvements if the report was either done or overseen or had someone participate in who had specific expertise with respect to accessibility?
Thank you for the question. I'm not certain. Certainly it wouldn't assist us with the Ministry of Education on this front, because the vast majority of funding that we put towards accessibility comes from annual facilities grant, which we determine for the most part the spending of. So I do not believe so, but with respect to external grants, I'm not sure what is available. So we looked into external grants, for instance, to potentially do this audit, and we weren't able to locate any funding for that purpose, but that's the extent of the research we did on external grants.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I may have missed a trustee. I'm going to invite Trustee Stanley. Trustee Stanley, I'll just give you the floor here.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I can't. I'm challenged because I don't exactly know my question. I'm uncomfortable moving forward as is because I think it's really important to meet the needs of people with actual challenges, and using a form or a template, or people that are, have no accessibility issues is limited. So I would like to, add to the recommended motion, or perhaps explore how it is that we can ask staff to seek that information about gaining the perspective of people who do have accessibility challenges. Because I think if we're going to do this, we should do it right. And I think it's extremely important. I mean, I hear facilities is busy. They are, but we're also talking about whether or not people can get in the front door of our schools, right? And we talk about people feeling safe and welcome in our schools. Well, not being able to get through the front door doesn't feel very welcoming. So how is it that we can get more information about getting someone who can speak from an actual experience perspective about how we can improve our accessibility, or how is it that we can get their feedback somehow? Is it possible that we can ask staff to somehow bring that information back to us for consideration?
We certainly can. Again, we've put the option to the board of an external consultant with its costs, which is certainly an option for the board. We haven't recommended it, and we've described the reasons why, but that may well be an alternative. Or alternatively, we could not pass this. We could go have some conversations in the community about what should be added to this, what shouldn't be added to this potentially, and come back to the board at a later time. Certainly, again, with COVID, whether it's going to be moving incredibly quickly, if it got passed tonight anyway, it probably wouldn't delay us too much to wait to another time. We just, again, when we saw the motion and we discussed, we thought we really need a document to guide some investment, and so we thought it was a good opportunity. But no reason why we can't go have some further discussions.
Okay, thank you for this and all the points that have been raised. I've added myself. I mean, we do have a recommendation before us, to be, put as a motion. I hear what a lot of trustees are saying. I myself see that there could be perhaps some amendment to this recommendation that would allow for this to go forward. And so just wondering if there's some thoughts on that if I move this recommendation. I know a number of trustees have mentioned that there may be an amendment that could be made. Trustee Higginson?
Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to type what I want to say, but I couldn't type it quick enough. So I guess my concern with amending it to, have an ad hoc committee or an advisory committee is just that I heard from staff that that they are concerned about workload. And so I'm kind of feeling in a bind that I don't want to put something on staff that they have expressed that they are not comfortable accepting yet. So I am hearing from our Secretary Treasurer, though, that he's willing to kind of hear our concerns and go back and kind of try to address them within that workload issue comment. Am I incorrect in hearing that, Secretary Treasurer?
Nope, you are correct.
So my preference would be that we don't move this recommendation yet, and we wait for staff to come back, having heard our concerns and trying to give us an update on how to address our concerns within their overall workload. Because if we don't pass it, it kind of just dies, and from a procedural perspective. So my preference would be that we hear that staff has said that they will take our considerations and come back. But I also recognize that somebody might be able to be much more wordsmithy with the amendments.
Okay, so we've heard one recommendation is that we do not move this motion, so that it would just, and I'm going to defer actually to you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, on how, would we table this then to the next business committee meeting to be sort of looked at before moving this motion? Would that follow procedure?
Well, I think that if it was deferred, it will need to be deferred to a specific time.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps the September business meeting might make sense, or obviously June as well. There'll just be a lot less time to be able to have some of the conversations in the meantime.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to put forward a motion then to suggest that we defer this recommendation to our September Business Committee meeting. Did I hear that right? I hope I did. Yes, and I see that that's been moved by Trustee Stanley and seconded by Trustee Brezovich. Trustee Keller, did you want to speak to this?
If I may, my only thought was, from what I'm hearing from some of the other trustees, is that sounds like we may want to get feedback from some of our folks in the community. And if we're already going to be going and engaging the community through the long-range facilities plan, would it make sense to try and wrap up some of that work so we don't get stakeholder fatigue? So, you know, perhaps there may be an opportunity if we're coming back in September, if this motion passes, based on the timing of the long-range facilities plan. I'm not sure, but I just thought I'd put that out there as a potential.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Keller. Trustee McKay.
Thank you. I'm in favor of deferring to September so that staff can go away and hear what they've heard from trustees. I'm uncomfortable with any consultation happening until we, as a board, make a decision around what our expectations are for what the audit looks like. I don't think that we can consult when we don't actually have a plan or a motion in place. So I'd be uncomfortable with that point on it, but I'm happy to wait until September to discuss this further after some further reflection by staff.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any further questions or comments on this motion, so I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? All those opposed? I suppose I only have to say opposed in this case. Habit. Okay, I don't see any opposition, so the motion has been moved, passed, and carried. And it's your night. I keep wanting to call you Trustee Secretary Treasurer Walsh.
Thank you.
It's your night, so you're on again, bringing forward with the Director of Finance, Tanya Sutton. Welcome, Tanya, and to go over the proposed 2020-21 preliminary annual budget. Over to you.
Great. So thank you so much, Chair. So again, I think the way that the questions came for that were quite good. So as I go through the slides, I will try to answer the questions that come up at your leisure, Chair. So tonight we're here to provide the proposed preliminary budget. And you'll see, as I understand, it's in a little bit of a different format than the board is used to year. And I just want to start off by thanking Director Sutton very, very much for her hard work. We've had a number of Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, etc. Conversations and planning as we've gone through this document. And so again, as we note, this is the proposed budget, and so there'll be opportunity for feedback, potential changes, and in fact, and as I noted in an email to trustees that I will flesh out here in the public meeting, we actually will already be recommending one change to this document to begin with, and when I get to the slide, I'll talk about that. So you'll see the district overview there, and then the message from the superintendent. And I think it's really important to highlight just briefly, we are in the most amazing, sorry, not amazing is maybe not the right word, but different time for everyone, and that is including from a budget perspective. Some of the decisions and some of the assumptions that we could make in the past are incredibly difficult to do so, from international students to what our enrollment looks like, to the potential impact on distance learning, to what the various stages of returning to school will look like, to what funding will look like if we have multiple waves of COVID and we're in and out of school in 1920. And so here we are with a proposed budget that's based on, largely status quo, and not totally status quo, but there's some unknowns and there is going to be some changes. And I do want to just say that at the outset. Another really important point that the superintendent has pointed out, and I know this board knows it very well, and I just want to make sure that the folks in the community and our stakeholders are aware as well. And that's the second to last paragraph of the superintendent's statement on page 18 of the agenda. And he says, finally, we anticipate savings in the current year ending June 2020. These savings are not in the budget and will not be known until the September board meeting. And I think that is important because people will be asking, well, how are we going to adapt to COVID? Why is staff proposing this or proposing, to use certain funds in certain ways? And we need to remember that we do anticipate that we're going to have some savings from the current school year to be able to adapt and pivot to the world and reality that we know is in September. And then finally, I just want to say it at the beginning as well, because I think it's really important, is that I know that this district, this board, senior staff are committed to having as many opportunities for district staff, particularly on the capital side. We're having discussions every day about that. And so you don't necessarily see all those jobs that might be created by that philosophy. But there will be additional CUPE jobs. For instance, we anticipate hiring a new electrician this week. So just as way of introduction. So on page 19, what guides the entire production of this budget is the strategic plan. And so I know there'll be questions which very happy to answer, but so how is the district, how is staff incorporating community comments? How is staff adapting to board priorities? And this is the document that leads us. And if we can't answer why we're making a recommendation in a certain way that doesn't connect to the strategic plan, well, that's where we expect some changes to happen. And so it's at the heart of everything that we're doing. And so I look forward to being able to respond to some of those questions. On page 20, you'll see our timelines. So next week, so tomorrow and the day after, staff will be meeting with our unions and hopefully also with PAC to have an opportunity for them to ask a few more questions to be able for them to present to the board next Wednesday about their concerns, the things they like about the budget, things they would like to see changed for the board's consideration. And then we'll be having another meeting on the 27th with some more specific numbers. On June 10th, that should read the Q3 report. So we'll get a sense of where the surplus was going for the current school year for the year at that time. And finally, because the board will have every answer that they need answered by June 17th, we're hopeful that there'll be an adoption of the preliminary annual budget. And as you're aware, September we'll come back, announce likely additional monies that are available to potentially spend on today's kids. Page 21, you'll see student enrollment. And so the 19-20 year that we are in and what we're anticipating for 2021. and beyond. That number initially we would say is a conservative number that includes international as well as domestic students. But at this point, that may well not be the case, depending on how many international kids we do end up getting, as well as what domestic enrollment looks like. Also, never not to be highlighted, and I just want to express being impressed with the 6-year dogwood completion rate that this board has accomplished. On page 22 is another important driver of funding, and you're going to see that particular number have an impact on staffing. And so this is special ed enrollment. And so you'll see 1920, as we talked about in our meeting a few weeks ago, a relatively big year for special education numbers. We are anticipating a lower number next year. And so as with the number of kids in a classroom impacts the number of teachers we have, often the number of special education students have impacts the number of EAs we have is a good correlation. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And then again, dogwood completion rates for children with special needs, again, trending the right direction. Another interesting blip that you're going to see. Oh. Why are we anticipating? Perhaps I can turn that. So the question is, why are we anticipating lower enrollment in our special needs next year? And can I perhaps turn that over to Director Sutton? Or is that more appropriately turned over to the Superintendent Director?
I'm happy to answer the question. Good evening. The enrollment for special education is anticipated to be lower because this year, as you can see by the numbers presented, was an outlier, and we've not seen numbers like that before. So to anticipate that we're going to see the next year with similar numbers and the funding that goes along with that is very, very high. If we don't see those numbers, we will be losing a great deal of funding. So we are being conservative in the annual budget. And if we see those student numbers, we will then increase the staffing with the funding that we see with the increased students.
And that's a relatively regular practice. And so I think what we'll see in September is the numbers may well come in above 744, but certainly not as high as 796. Perhaps I could get through the chair, get the trustee to ask the question with respect to the predicting of an overall increase.
So I have permission to speak, Chair? Chair's muted, but I'm now live, I can tell, so I'm just going to answer. Mark, or trustee, or sorry, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, my question was answered, thank you. It was regard to understanding it as an outlier was useful. I was only comparing it to the, that we were predicting or anticipating a lower number of students with unique needs in contrast or in the context of predicting an overall general enrollment increase, but that it's an outlier this year explains everything, so thank you.
So again, you'll see the dogwood completion rates are not where they need to be, but certainly trending in the right direction. Indigenous enrollment, again, we are anticipating a slightly smaller number next year of our Indigenous students. And again, that's going to impact funding to our Aboriginal department. And again, if more students show up in the summer in schools, then there will be more funding that goes with them as well. And trustees are very much used to, I believe, the amended annual budget having higher numbers than the proposed budget that we're proposing now. And again, just as a new person coming in, just congratulations on the continued increase in success. So the number of these graphs I'm not going to go over in any depth, and if there's questions, I'd be happy to respond to them. But you will see that increased enrollment. Same question. So, Director Sutton, could you answer the same question with respect to Aboriginal student enrollment? Whether it's conservative budgeting or whether this year was a blip and we...
Yes, again, the last couple of years we've seen a rise. However, not sure that we're anticipating that that's going to continue to grow. So just to be, again, sure that we're not going to find ourselves in an overfunded position, we're suggesting that we're coming in relatively conservative, and if we see that increase in the fall, then funding will flow to the target.
Thank you.
And just generally as well, learning services and financial services, they do correspond with to discuss what appropriate numbers are from regular enrollment to other types of enrollment as well, based off of Beauregard, based off experience of the various departments, and that's where those numbers come from. So again, we do anticipate them to be a little bit higher than what you're seeing now, but we feel that they're defensible estimates that we shouldn't be falling below. So again, you'll see the forecasted operating grants, which we've talked about the basis for where we get those funds in the operating grant and the reason for the increase. So the vast majority of the reason for the increase on page 23, I apologize, Karen, is due to various labor settlement funds, as well as various, increased enrollment over time. Director, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that was absolutely correct, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. We did not account for any per pupil increase because, of course, that is unknown, but our enrollment estimate as submitted to the ministry in February is what the basis for this overall projection is, using the rates that we know as of now. So if, of course, there is an increase in that going forward, then potentially more revenue, but this is based on that 3-year enrollment projection that was sent to the ministry in February.
Okay.
Can I just want to interject as well. There was a moment there where I was on mute and I was unable to, I think you saw my lips moving, but didn't hear what I was saying. Just wanted to acknowledge that there was a previous question from a trustee, and you answered that question, Mark, but it was from Trustee Brozovich. The similar question to what Trustee Stanley had posed, but asking about unique needs, the accounts, what accounts for the drop with Indigenous students. I just wanted to make that question clear for everyone who's joining, because they don't necessarily see the questions and who's asking them. Okay.
Apologies, Chair.
No worries. Carry on.
If we move on to page 24, again, it goes over what special purpose funds. I know everyone in this meeting is probably very aware of what the various special purpose funds are, and a trend line that you can see the difference in what those special purpose funds do. And so you can see the classroom enhancement fund and bringing back the class size and composition language from the past has had an enormous impact on funding of the special purpose grants. And so certainly as a percentage of our overall spending, it's quite high. And so the CEF, and we'll talk about the CEF in a little bit more, as you're aware, is to support the return of that language as it impacts Nanaimo Ladysmith. And so there's a couple of changes this year that we're going to go into a little bit more depth. New money for the kids in poverty. Question. So I believe is that the equity of opportunity. So sorry, there's a question. I'm sorry, Chair. Sorry.
And that's okay. You know, we talked about sort of sharing this for ease of flow of the presentation, but it's a question from Trustee Brezovich. Does this list include the newly mentioned dollars for kids in poverty?
And through the chair, if I could just confirm, it's the Equity of Opportunity Fund, I believe. Is that? So in the main grant, in the main operating grant, is where the new funds that were created by the ministry would appear.
Okay, Trustee Brezovich, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, I just wanted to figure out where that money was.
Okay. So,
and probably spending too much time on background, but I think it's really useful. So if you're on page 25, just to give a sense of where staffing ratios are and the number of adults to kids, and to the superintendent's comment about how you know, how important the connection of having sufficient number of adults to connect to our students is, and you'll see the changes in the number of FTE from 13-14 to 19-20, despite, you know, like the enrollment not growing significantly, but a significant number more FTE, particularly when it comes to teachers and to a certain extent education assistants as well.
Okay, we have a question from Trustee Keller. Why is support staff proposed to be reduced?
Sure, and so the graph on, or sorry, that decrease in support staff on 25 of 49 is not a proposed reduction, it's actually a decline. So you'll see the school district went up by 1,000 students between 13-14 and 19-20, but support staff has actually lost staff. So I'll ask the director to correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that is the fact that, you know, as we've increased teachers, as education assistants, etc., we haven't necessarily increased support for facilities or, you know, that area. And perhaps I could ask the director to comment.
Yes, the historical information is showing that there was cuts to QP back in 14-15 and 15-16, and then slowly it's starting to rise and back to what appears to be a little bit less than where we were back in 13-14. But very important to note that, again, as Mr. Walsh indicated earlier, Secretary Treasurer Walsh, we find some challenges with the capital works, and when we have very large projects that we're doing, we are hiring people in ebb and flow to support those projects, and they're not necessarily placed in the budget because they're not always things we know of in advance. So they're a reactive as opposed to a proactive approach. So it's actually an understated figure. And unfortunately, it's difficult to change that. So we are probably a few or 4 or 5 FTE higher than what you're seeing there.
But also, just to be clear, this is a historical number. We are not proposing a decline in support staff. The 0.89 is just what's occurred over the past 6 years.
Thank you. Trustee Keller, I don't see an indication on a follow-up, so I'll take it. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So on page 26, you'll see the start of our special purpose fund, so our annual facilities grant. I believe this presentation of what the intended expenditures in the AFG was presented to the board in March. And so it's under the AFG that you'll see examples of what we're spending our money on every year, but roofs are the vast majority of it. You know, functional improvements, disability access is another example. There's money for lead remediation in this budget. This is one of the few areas that lead remediation may be dealt with. But these numbers, the annual facilities grant is typically, dealt with at a time prior to our budget discussion that we're going through tonight. And I believe the items in this year's budget, or this year's annual facilities grant, were presented to the board in March and are available for review in the March agenda.
Trustee Keller asks, can you please expand on the lead, and I don't know if that's lead
abatement?
Lead abatement, yes, thank you. Sorry, I was struggling.
Sure. So as I understand, in March of last year, the ministry lowered the expected standards. I believe it was the ministry lowered the expected standards of lead from by 50%, I believe it was. And so what that did was it took the lead program that was essentially complete or close to it to needing further abatement. And so we as a district fund some abatement through the AFG, and then we fund, this year you'll see, and I believe we're bringing our capital ask for 21-22 to the June board meeting, and in that particular ask, the trustees will see multiple requests for funding through the school enhancement program to fund further lead abatement. So whether that's the exchange or changing out pipes, whether that's exchanging, putting filters in, whether that's exchanging older sinks, we'll make sure that in the June report that Mr. Sabo will have all the data of the exact expectations of what that ask will be.
Thank you.
Okay, so the Classroom Enhancement Fund. And so we talked a little bit about it. And so the board will recall a number of years ago, when the funds came into the system, there was actually 4 different pots of money. One was to hire teachers for the purposes of class size, composition, and ratios of specialist teachers. One was overhead. So if you're going to hire 100 teachers, which is, I believe, what we did, you're going to need to have HR support. You're going to need to clean the additional classrooms. You're going to need to, onboard, new teachers to the system. And so there are a variety of aspects in overhead to support that. Remedy is an example of where we can't meet the required collective agreement language, and teachers are entitled to co-teach or to prep a number of different options for teachers that they can access if they have a class that are over the limits in the collective agreement. Finally, there was a capital side, which was to actually build the spaces that the old language required. The capital side is exhausted now, and we're down to the three pots. Now, I'll take trustees to the bottom of page 27, and there's 2 major changes you will see. One is that we are proposing that the teacher staffing, well, I should say not we are proposing, the ministry is only going to fund 90% of what our CEF pot was, I believe, in the 18-19 year. And the reason for that is because we are required to go and prove to the ministry that we require all of those funds. And so what I mean is in elementary schools, we largely know what they're going to look like. So we know what class size and composition and the numbers we need to be able to issue enough staffing to build those schools now. It's much more difficult in high school. Kids come and go, kids change classes, enrollment shifts. And so because we can't go to the ministry today and show them what that's going to look like, they're not going to fund us to what the full extent of the CEF we think should be. So what we did last year as a district is we actually we budgeted money assuming that we would get additional funds, and then the ministry said, well, no, you can't anticipate like that. So the board used unrestricted surplus in order to fund what we anticipated to happen. So it worked last year because the numbers turned out. But this year, because we knew that we couldn't budget that way, there was a discussion about making sure that we weren't ever going to have to go into a school and take away staffing actually after we had issued staffing. So you'll see one of the main drivers of the loss of FTE when we go down and talk about teachers is associated with this decline. Want to be clear though, in September, we anticipate that we are going to get much or not, or perhaps all of this back. But the difficulty is we don't know where we're going to get it back. And so in order to keep the funding level at what it was last year, we'd be asking the board to spend its surplus in the hope that those kids arrive. And so this is a bit more of a predictable and safe way to budget CEF in this regard. The second change is the overhead, and you'll see the overhead dropping by $170,000. And that's just an across the board decline. And I believe it's impacted every district in the same way. And I'm not sure the basis by it. And so I could only give my best guess to suggest that a lot of the purpose of overhead at the beginning was for purposes associated with the hiring of all these teachers. And so some of that need has dissipated. So there are changes to the overhead.
Okay, and we'll just pause. We have a question from NDTA representative Denise Wood, and I'll, like with others, allow for a follow-up after. The question is, if we anticipate getting it back, wouldn't it be more stable and better for students to gamble on what we expect is most likely?
So certainly, I think the most important part of the question is the word gamble, and that's where we're trying to be very careful. And so I think, again, I think it's a fair point to say that we certainly do anticipate students coming back, but we would be concerned because we couldn't go to the ministry and say we anticipate these students. We would actually have to use any surpluses that are available to fund it, and hope that those FTE ultimately stream in, and that's why we're recommending going a different direction.
Denise, Ms. Wood, did you have a follow-up to that?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I guess what I'm asking is, we're creating, it's an unknown. Either we're going to have to put more staffing in September, in which case it will be very disruptive, or we're going to have to surplus staffing in September, which will also be very disruptive. So if we are not sure, shouldn't we err on the side of what's most likely? If we do have surplus funds that we can use right now to create that budget, and then maybe we don't have to use those surplus funds because we are likely to get that from the ministry, but in the off chance we don't, then we can be disruptive to classes. That's what I'm asking, because every September we've had such disruption with trying to put more staffing in, and we've been doing that every year. Thank you.
Well, and certainly, again, that could be an option for the board to consider. And we do, as I noted earlier, we do anticipate that there will be likely slightly higher enrollment than we're predicting in secondaries as well. Of course, our hope is more to have secondaries probably have to do some of that work in August if possible. But again, given the environment, given we don't know who's coming, given we don't know where they're coming necessarily, and given that the direction the ministry said to not recognize that revenue, that's the basis for the budget recommendation.
So there's a follow-up from Trustee Brezovich, and then I have another question from Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. And staff, I don't necessarily expect an answer to this right now. It's something I wouldn't mind having for next week. Do we have any sense of where we are in terms of our centralized registration compared to this time last year? So basically, are we on track compared to where we were last year?
With thanks, if we could take that away, Trustee, that would be appreciated.
Trustee Higginson has a question. Is there a contractual issue with being able to lay off staff in September?
Perhaps I could ask the superintendent if he could farm that question out to staff.
And fair enough. Is Superintendent Saywell on right now?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. There is. It's the challenge. There is no contractual issue. The challenge is it's much easier to add staff than to subtract staff in September, which is why we're always conservative in our projections and budgeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see as well, so there's a question here from Trustee Keller, but I also see Miss Wood has added before Mr. Saywell was able to respond that she would be able to respond. Anything to add there, Miss Wood?
No, I agree with Scott.
Okay, thank you for that. Trustee Keller, would including this in the budget now benefit students more than hiring in September when we confirm the numbers?
I would have to, again, I believe, turn that over to the superintendent.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. What question is that?
So Trustee Keller has posed, would including this in the budget now benefit students more than hiring in September when we confirm the numbers?
Well, it's almost the same answer. We're always conservative in our budgeting, and it's way better to be low than to be high. And that's a real challenge for us in September because we're laying off teachers. It's much better to, and by the way, it's much better to hire more teachers in September when we know when the numbers are in and the funding is in. It's a challenge either way, and I do appreciate Ms. Wood's comments as well.
Thank you. Speaking of comments, I have a comment here from Trustee McKay.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to share my concern with the board not being conservative. I think that we are in a position this year where we have to be conservative, and perhaps the next question coming is going to speak to this. But given our uncertain times, due to COVID and due to, an uncertain future of what education looks like in our buildings for in-person learning, I'm concerned that we won't see transitions into distance learning and other types of things. And so I caution the board from my own perspective that we should be considering those different types of things. Next year isn't necessarily a normal year, and I think being conservative is in our best interest because we're going to have a lot of unknowns that we have to sort out come September. I just wanted to share those thoughts with the board. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Trustee Higginson has put a question here. What happens to our funding if students who are currently full-time equivalent and they move to distributed learning due to the uncertain times we are in? Would that impact our overall funding? So I think echoing a bit of Trustee McKay's points, another example of that.
Thank you, Chair. So so trustees are aware, DL funded students get approximately $6,100 per student. So that's approximately $1,500 less than a student that would be enrolled full-time in a secondary. So the issue would be twofold. So one would be obviously slightly less income, or not income, but revenue coming from those students that do choose to do DL. But the other issue is the fact is they wouldn't be in the secondary school that we would have staffed them for. And so when we say that we're relatively confident that those students will show up and that we will have more CEF revenue, the two risks are: one, they don't show up, and I guess it's three risks now. Two, they move to DL, or three, they show up at a different school but we staff school X and they ended up at school Y, or we staff school X and they ended up at the DL program. And so that's hence the conservative recommendations.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions there, so if you want to carry on with the presentation.
Sure. So the next is, I noted the overhead budget had a fairly significant across the board cut or reduction, I guess. And so what we did is we actually, as a district, were relatively fortunate in the manner in reviewing and in my experience in how the ministry has supported the overhead request of the district. And so there was a few pots of supplies budgets that we've looked at that are now essentially have to be taken out that should have limited impact. And then additionally, there was 2 EAs that we've moved from overhead to the operating budget because obviously we didn't, there were concerns about taking those folks out. Director, would you like to comment further?
Thank you. I would actually like to make one point regarding the reduction of the CEF FTE and the complication of what happens early in the budget and in September. And, I think one of the big issues is that this year we are anticipating more students at the secondary level. And it's very important that the district is able to substantiate our ask to the ministry under the Classroom Enhancement Fund. And in that, we have to run the numbers of the students through the School Act language and then through the restored language. And if the increased number of students drives more blocks under the School Act, then that is not something that we can submit to the ministry under the CEF. So that work has to be done when we know what our enrollment is and we can justify. So a big gamble as to whether or not we actually will see that. We're hopeful that we will, but that work needs to be done on what we actually see for students and designations come the early fall.
Okay, if you turn to page 29, well, the top of 28 and 29, the Learning Improvement Fund. So you'll recall when the CEF came in, the Learning Improvement Fund disappeared for teachers and moved into the CEF, but the Learning Improvement Fund was maintained for CUPE. And so you'll just see there's really minimal change except for two additional EAs, which means that there's just a little bit of extra need to be able to top those positions up. The next on page 29 and then on to page 30 is Community Link. And as I noted at the get-go, trustees will be aware that staff will actually be making an alternative recommendation with respect to that. It's not reflected on this page. So the way Community Link funding works is that we do get Community Link funding from the ministry for the purposes set out in the memo. And then this year we've received a little increase, but it's not a significant enough increase to actually fund all of the salary changes. So when the ministry, or when the collective agreement with CUPE or the teachers was signed, the ministry says, okay, we're going to make sure that we fund that, but that doesn't necessarily flow to the community link budget either. So here we have an example of last year where we actually had a bit of a surplus from the 18-19 school year to have a 2.379 million available to community link. Well, unfortunately this year we only have $2.311 million available because the surplus is not available to us. So essentially there's already a deficit created in the community link budget. And then secondarily, of course, is that we have increased costs associated with it. So what you will see in this slide is the proposal to remove one community school coordinator and 2 school foods program planners. And then a slight increase in the reserves for support allocation. So when September rolls around, there's a little bit of additional money centrally to be able to be provided to somewhere that is in grave need. But what we've realized though is 2 things. One, given that we are just simply not aware of exactly where we're going with COVID, and that we may be in and out of stages of the government stages of education next year, and the fact that we haven't had the proper time to actually consult on what those impacts look like, we're actually going to be recommending to the board a slight shift to this. And so first of all, we would not be proposing to cut the community school coordinator position, the one of 5 of them. We would not be looking to reduce the school foods program coordinator. What we would be looking to do is reduce the reserves for support allocation to $30,000. And then we would also ask the board on a one-time basis to dip into what we've created for the COVID support fund to be able to fund the additional approximately $60,000. And that way it'll give staff time to be able to come to the district or come to the board with a plan and a bit of an impact statement on what those changes are looking like. And again, so you know, normally the board wouldn't be asked to subsidize Community Link from operating, but again, for the reason of COVID and for the reason of insufficient time to properly consult, we're not going to be recommending going this direction. So this document would be changed as a recommendation for the final proposed budget.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question from Trustee Higginson, and that question is, would that position be directed to toward COVID response activities?
Through you, Madam Chair. So theoretically it could, and I believe those folks are helping with that right now, but no, what we would be looking to do is when the September amended budget comes, we'd be looking to, or September, our end of year surplus for 1920, we'd be looking to ask the board to replenish the COVID response fund with those funds, which we do believe will be there.
Okay, and I see there's a follow-up from Trustee Higginson on that.
Thank you. So right now, you're not talking about a change in a job description. You're just talking about using funds that are currently set aside for COVID response for next year to fund the position.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Trustee Brozovich has a comment.
I just want to say thank you. I appreciate this proposal because one of the questions I was going to ask, which I don't expect an answer to right now then, would be about the impact of cutting particularly the school food program planner and the community school coordinator in terms of what would happen to that work. So I think this could be a good change.
Okay, thanks for your comments, Trustee.
So then if we look at our official language education program, essentially the funding is stable, but there is a change that you will note, and I believe we'll turn that over to Chair's permission to the Deputy Superintendent just to review the change.
Deputy Superintendent.
And so you'll note, sorry,
Okay.
intro it.
You might have to
Okay.
carry on, Mark.
So, and we can come back to it later. So what you'll see is that there's a proposal to increase the amount of FTE in a teaching position and a coordinator position there to better support schools, and a decrease to the amount of supplies and services, because I believe the rationale, and I'm sure the deputy will talk more about this if there's questions, is that it was felt that the way that it's getting sent to schools may not be as impactful in supporting our languages as having a coordinator position to be able to assist in that way. And so that's the rationale as I understand that. Okay.
Thank you. And I don't see any questions or comments on that, and certainly the Deputy Superintendent can add anything, but
I will thank you, through the chair.
There we go.
Yeah, thank you. So the Secretary Treasurer is correct in terms of what the intention of that decrease is, and again, it's for additional training and supports, particularly in terms of release time for teachers directly in the classroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So unless,
question. I'm going to give Trustee Barron the floor to ask her question. I assume that's what the Q stands for.
Hi, sorry about that. Sometimes you just don't have time to write the question and you'll miss your turn there if you don't get something down. So apologies for only writing a Q. Thank you, through the chair. I'm wondering, perhaps you can clarify, now I'm forgetting all the roles. Assistant Tim Davey. Your role is assistant. Somebody help me out here.
Deputy Superintendent.
Thank you so much. Well, I really got to write those down, have them in front of me when I'm working from home. Could you clarify the specific to the reduction of supplies that you were referring to in the French immersion program, and do we know what that might look like? Can we get some more information around that and what impact it might have on the schools? Is that what you said, that it would be a reduction in the?
I was referring to a reduction in a coordinator position that would support literacy training for classroom teachers.
Okay, so okay, let me write down the question and I'll get back to you. It was specifically around enrolled in French as a second language. And so I was trying to figure out the French immersion program specific, how that would work. But I'll write the question down. Let me just get back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So strong. Oh, should I proceed for the moment?
Secretary Treasurer.
So I wasn't going to review the strong start and the ready, set, learn in any depth unless there was questions, because there's minimal changes.
Okay, let's just give an opportunity then if there's any specific questions to those. What pages does that cover, Secretary Treasurer Walsh?
31, 32, 31 and 32.
Okay. So I'm not seeing any specific questions on those, so you can continue through the presentation, and I guess at the end, if there's if we wanted to go back to any of these, we could. So, sure. Thanks.
So you'll see on page 33 the overall impact of what were the proposed budget, with the asterisks added on the community link funding with respect to CUPE. So you'll see the overall impact of what we're proposing For the Classroom Enhancement Fund, the decline in QP positions is actually reflected as increased QP positions for EAs in the operating fund. And then as noted, we expect that most of the decline in the teaching portion associated with CEF will return in fall when we're able to prove that the need for those teachers is there, but that will be required upon us. The Learning Improvement Fund going up, that's strictly just because of those 2 additional positions moving from CEF to the operating, that's the EAs. And then again, based off of what we will be proposing, the community link budget with respect to QP would just be a wash. It wouldn't be a negative 2.386. And then finally, Federal French, just as we noted, additional FTE that would be going to NDTA position to support that. So, given we went through the basis for the changes to the operating grants this year on page 34 and 35, I wasn't going to go into any depth unless there was questions. So the basis for where our revenue is coming from. Now,
Okay, seeing no comments,
I'm always happy to go back and forth. So, international student education program. I think that this is the biggest unknown that we have in this entire budget, and you will see that we are proposing an extremely conservative estimate with respect to enrollment, as in dropping from 250 to just over 60, I believe that number is. And so that's obviously has a big impact in our schools in a couple of ways. First, it impacts obviously our enrollment, and so there's less teachers to serve those kids. It will also impact the amount of money the receiving schools gets in their supplies budgets that stem directly from the board requirements about funding into schools for international students. And so that's pretty big. And so what we're saying is we don't know for sure that we're only going to get as few kids as we thought. What we have been contemplating, however, is that we know that there's a number of international students that have already paid their tuition, and there's a number of international students that actually happen to still be in the country. And so that's the basis that we've made our predictions on. I think it's really important too to comment that I think a media statement was made by the Premier a number of days ago that there wouldn't be layoffs with respect to international students. We haven't had any guidance. We've reached out to the ministry with respect to that, and we're anticipating that we would be required to plan the way we would normally be planning. That may change if indeed there's a pot of money that the government does announce, but we are not anticipating that. So that's, I think, pretty important to say. So if you go to page 36, you will see the decline of students from 263 to 67. It certainly could be more. I would suggest unlikely to be less, but it's possible too, but we've gone where we think is defensible. So you can see the direct impacts. $1 million out of staffing, 270,000 not going to schools, agent fees, which is just a wash, medical expenses, which is a wash, it's money we just don't have to spend, travel, which our coordinators will likely be doing less of because of the fact that people are not allowed to fly, and then a decrease in the supplies budget. But what we haven't proposed is getting rid of the program. And so what would remain in this circumstance is that the district principal, the program coordinator, the 2 homestay coordinators, a language support worker, and clerical staff would remain under the budget that we're proposing to you. We think that if this program is going to come back, it needs to have staff available. Perhaps the superintendent, through you, Chair, may like to comment on what folks would be doing if it indeed is slow.
Superintendent Saywell, did you want to speak?
Well, only minimally, because we would be speaking about particular employees, but just to say that as Secretary Treasurer Walsh mentioned, if there isn't any travel and our district principal and our coordinator are unable to recruit, then certainly, you know, we would deem that situation ISE to be overstaffed, and we have plans to redeploy the staff in that program should we not be able to build that program up over the next year.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Trustee Stanley. Why do we think we need 2 homestay coordinators given the number of predicted international students?
So, thank you through the chair. Two reasons. One is that if we still are going to have students that do need support. In addition, I think this is probably a question that may be asked in camera. We wouldn't be wanting to talk about specific individuals, but needless to say, I think it's our opinion that the financial impact on the program by a reduction in the circumstances would not gain the district much value.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for reminding us of, you know, being mindful of some of these discussions. Trustee Higginson is asking, are we proposing to fund those through or by using a surplus? The program would be running a financial deficit. Would the program be running a financial deficit? I hope I captured that question.
Yes, the answer is yes. So you'll see the revenues would be outweighed by the expenses in the circumstances, and so we are proposing utilizing restricted surplus, a restricted staffing fund surplus, to be able to support it for the year. If, of course, COVID continued and we thought that international programming would never return, or we as a district did not want it to return, then we'd probably be making a different recommendation. But because we think it's a blip, and because we are staffing or taking enrollment projections that are conservative and hopeful that they are higher, and perhaps in January higher, this is one of the places where the board would be using that deficit so the program is able to survive.
Okay. And I guess I'm going to jump queue here. Trustee Higginson asks, what is the number of students required to break even?
So perhaps, well, next question gets asked. I can ask Director Sutton to do some quick math.
Okay, yep. So Trustee Keller also has a question. Would the reduction in the FTE result in layoffs in the end? Or are there any unfilled positions or redeployment options?
Through you, Chair, can I confirm that the question is with respect to teacher staffing?
Trustee Keller, can you clarify?
Yes, yeah, that was my question. Just to give you some context, perhaps. You know, as you had mentioned, you know, there's a lot of unknowns, but we're hoping this is going to be a blip. So there's still likely to be demand in the program, and I'm hoping that our district, once we're advised that it's safe to do so again, continue on. So I was just hoping that to know a little bit more about the impact on staff and what would actually happen to those positions. And I'm sorry, Trustee Saywell, or sorry, Superintendent Saywell. I think you may have touched on this. I was trying to type the question, so I may have missed your response.
But through the chair, yeah, great question. We are dropping in enrollment in ISE students, but if you thought of those students just as regular students in classrooms, we'll have less ISE students, but we're looking at a conservative estimate of 160 or 176 new students. So the effect on teacher staffing will be minimal.
Thank you. That helps me with my understanding.
Okay, so we'll perhaps, Chair, we can come back to the break-even question when we have that number.
I think that's fair, and no pressure. Those numbers can't be crunched right now. We can get that answer at a later time.
Director Sutton is amazing, and she's ready to speak, I think.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Hi, this is approximate, but we would require approximately 87 more students, so for 154 total in order to break even.
Thank you for that. Would there be a follow-up to that, Trustee Higginson?
Not yet. I think this will probably warrant further discussion as we move through our budgeting process. So I'm just trying to understand the full numbers.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Secretary Treasurer.
Okay. So if you turn to page 37, here's, I guess, where the big variance numbers would be coming from. So the amounts from the MOE grant and other Ministry of Education grants, we addressed in our previous meeting about the changes to the way that the ministry is funding us. It would be the local revenue that I really want to focus on. Again, happy to answer any questions, but you will see the significant variance in international student education, down $2.8 million in revenue. You will see, I will note that the rentals and leases, that's a risk area for us, certainly in budgeting. But because we're not quite aware of the COVID impact yet, and because frankly, in the earlier memo, I noted that we have let some folks are having some trouble paying their leases. It's been surprisingly minimal overall. So given that we don't quite know what's going to be the wave of the world in September, we've maintained that number for those two reasons. Investment income, of course, the Bank of Canada has stepped in to try to let everyone borrow more money. And so that's caused us a big hit in our interest revenues, so down 295,000. And then, of course, the restricted surplus number dropping. And then here's the other big one is, so year to year, or a number of years ago, the board approved the plan to expand Wi-Fi and technology in our schools to really modernize our schools to allow it to catch up to 21st century learning. And so last year, a fairly significant number was transferred from operating to local capital. And so a couple of things to note is that, one, that money hasn't been spent quite as fast, I think, as we were hoping. I noted that we've had a few meetings in the last 3 weeks or so that I think we're getting it rolling really fast, and they're doing a really good job at speeding up the expenditure. But because there's some money in local capital for that purpose, we thought that we wouldn't recommend to the board an additional 1.4 into local capital, because we really need to spend today's dollars on today's kids, and that could sit in the local capital pot for a number of years. So we are still recommending a transfer because we obviously have maintenance, we obviously have to buy more technology, and as we get that shot in the arm to our IT plan, we're going to have technology to purchase to install in schools. So we are still recommending a transfer, but it is significantly less. And that's one of the ways that we're able to have relatively small impact in the way that we're funding our programs.
I couldn't unmute myself for a second there. I see Trustee Keller has a question. What is the estimated time frame for the Wi-Fi upgrade, and will the money be exhausted this year?
Through you, Chair. So the time frame, we intend to come back to the board hopefully in June to provide an update on where we are at. Will the money be exhausted in June? The answer is no. So again, we're hiring another QP electrician. There may be more than that coming after that. We're planning on how to, save some money by not duplicating work during seismic, but there will be some money left. We anticipate, our plan is to spend everything that's in the pot there now, plus the additional request for the 622 by the end of next school year. And if we anticipate, and if there is a surplus, we may come back to the board and recommend that a further transfer happen.
Another question from Trustee Brezovich. Can the Secretary Treasurer speak to what we are doing differently to lower our greenhouse gas emissions and reduce our carbon footprint?
Specifically from a budgetary perspective, like how is it reflected in the budget for those who have trouble reading these things?
Okay. So
I made the presumption it would be from that perspective, given we're talking about the budget.
Perhaps could I come back to that question as we get closer to the end of the presentation?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
That would be fine, and I'm going to entertain a question by Trustee McKay. Trustee McKay?
My apologies, Chair. I was trying to type and I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it through there.
No.
I'm curious if it's an option for us to transfer the funds to local capital from our surplus and reduce the amount of restricted surplus that we're using to balance the budget. Does my question make sense?
Sir, could you ask it one?
Well, instead of transferring operating funds into local capital, could we not transfer surplus into local capital, thereby reducing the restricted surplus funds used to cover the deficit from ICE?
So I'm. Director Sutton, do you have a thought? It sounds like we would be from the question. Certainly we can, the board has the opportunity, sorry, I could answer it like this. The board has the opportunity to unrestrict funds or change what their restricted use is for, as long as they're not targeted restricted funds. So if we have Aboriginal education rollover that happens to be in the restricted surplus, you can't use those funds, or the board can't choose to use those funds for a different purpose. If the board has the contingency for staffing, the board certainly could change what it's using that contingency for, or in the unrestricted surplus. So what we're proposing here is to use that restricted staffing surplus for the purposes of maintaining the international program for the most part. So we could transfer that amount to the local capital pot, but then I'm not sure that it would solve our issue.
Thank you. No, that's fair.
Do you have something to add?
I would just add that if we reduce the transfer to local capital, that would gain us more operating dollars and reduce the need for restricted surplus use for ICE, but it would not solve our problem of supporting our technology plans. So we would be looking for another way to increase that 622 if we reduced it. So I'm not sure that it would be.
I think what you're saying is that it would be 6 of one or a half dozen of the other. I'm thinking it would be unrestricted surplus rather than operating funds to pay for that local capital amount, but it's either or, same thing. Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, so this is a big thinker kind of a question, so I'll invite anyone to come back, Ms. Sutton or Secretary Treasurer to speak to that. In the meantime, we do have another question from, I think Trustee Higginson has just withdrawn her question, so. And she'll let me know if that's not the case. No? Okay. Sure. Trustee Higginson, why don't you just ask your question?
Okay, sorry. I just,
okay.
I was just saying that if there's not an answer for it tonight, it can be at a future meeting, was what I was trying to type. But what I'm trying to understand is there is suggestions throughout the presentation tonight about utilizing surplus to balance our budget. And what I'd like to get is I'm going to be honest, the writing on the wall for me is very concerning about future budgets, not necessarily this year's budget. So I'm feeling quite protective of our surplus and contingency funds. So I'm just wondering if whether it can't be at this meeting, because I understand that this is kind of sprung on you, but an overview of the state of our contingency funds, along with the impact that the proposals of utilizing the various surplus funds would have on those funds in terms of the amounts that we are recommended to keep in those funds according to our policy. So our restricted is supposed to be 1.2 to 2.5% of our operating. Unrestricted 0.5 to 2% of our total operating. So I'm just wondering if we could have, when we have these recommendations about surplus, if there's somewhere that we could get an update on the impact it would have on our contingency funds.
Sure. So I can, or through you, Madam Chair, I could answer, and I think Director Sutton can fill in the gaps, but we are not proposing to use the board's unrestricted surplus of $1.3 million. So that would remain in place. And so that wouldn't be impacted by what we're recommending. So that rainy day fund, so to speak, would continue. We're not asking to or proposing to increase it, but we are not touching that particular money. With respect to the various other restricted surplus pots, perhaps I can turn that over to Director Sutton.
Yes, through the chair. So we have our internally restricted staffing contingency reserve in the amount of 1.3, and we have other restricted money that is not allocated. The use of the 1.12 leaves us in a compliant position with the surplus policy. We are also not recommending the use of the unrestricted balance. So the 1.28, Secretary Treasurer Walsh is correct, that remains. We are only suggesting to use this staffing contingency as that's exactly what its use is for, as something emergent in this case. And we would not be reducing it below what the reserve is subject to within the policy. And of course, hoping that we can recover revenues and see those students possibly. Does that answer the question?
And perhaps I can add one other part. With respect to the unrestricted number, we're watching the requirement quite tightly because due to the underspend that we've seen in schools since COVID hit, there are a lot of unspent budgets. We don't quite know exactly where we're at, but there is a very possibility that our unrestricted surplus could be coming up to the line of over 2, which of course in September many of the presentations we're making here are suggesting that We're hopeful that there'll be money to be spent in September. Given the unpredictable nature, we can't predict it now, but we do have our eyes on that policy to make sure that we don't go under on the restricted side and over on the unrestricted side.
Thank you. Another question from Trustee McKay. Would we then be looking to top up the staffing contingency in September after using it for the operating budget?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that would be one of the recommendations that we would be bringing, is to make sure that we're replenishing any of the contingency funds that we're accessing, particularly given the unknowns with respect to COVID, prior to recommending any one-time spending.
Thank you. Trustee McKay, did you have a follow-up? No. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've touched on. Question.
Trustee Higginson?
I'm sorry, I honestly keep trying to type it and then I lose, and then I have to delete it. So actually my question is about, I'm actually looking for the superintendent to answer about what we are looking at. I know that you've got $200,000 right now in COVID response money set aside, but I'm wondering if I could get some discussion or thoughts on what our senior team is thinking about in terms of enhanced cleaning protocols for the schools next year under the current COVID, and what our thoughts are about staffing levels in order to be able to meet those increased cleaning protocols that we expect to be in place.
Thank you. Through the chair. I don't have any numbers present. I could come back to those. Deputy Superintendent, I don't want to pass the buck when he doesn't have the answer on what we're looking at for more staffing. But I'll pass it to the deputy to see if he has a response. Thanks for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Superintendent, through the chair. What I can speak to is our present staffing levels in terms of custodial cleaning. What we're looking at is an increase to the elementary settings, particularly those settings where we have the learning and care centers. We do have full day coverage, and we also have coverage for a portion of the evenings at those centers, and that is directly a result in reduction at the secondary level where we don't have students presently attending. And as trustees are aware, we have teachers on a invitation to attend to their classrooms at this point. So as we move forward, we are still looking at our staffing levels in terms of custodial supports to those schools, and really it's a matter of us determining if there's illness or if there's staff that are absent. Do we need to be putting somebody in from a casual position into those spots? So we're just really almost day by day looking at the increase in numbers, both for students that are attending the ESW classrooms, and we're looking at the increase in teacher staffing that are attending to the schools.
Okay, and I see that there's a follow-up question from Trustee Higginson.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for that information, Deputy Superintendent Davey. But I'm actually looking for, and I looked, and maybe I missed it, and I apologize if I did, because the graphs, you know, I'm terrible with this stuff. I'm just actually looking at our next year's budget, and if we have, if we are starting to think about it for next year, and if we have increased staffing for cleaning requirements to meet health and safety protocols when we open next year.
And perhaps through the chair, could I start the response?
I think so, and I'm looking at Trustee Keller's question, and I think it's in the same vein. It's quite lengthy and gives some specific examples. Could I read that out as well?
Happy to.
Is that, thank you. So there are so many unknowns in relation to COVID and returning to school. For example, do we need extra janitorial services? What about hand washing, sanitizing station, PPE for staff? Do we need to retrofit our buses to ensure social distancing and staff safety? Are shared water fountains safe, or do we need to consider alternative precautions? Do we need any new equipment, foggers, cleaning supplies? What additional resources and costs related to COVID that the board should be aware of and plan for in this budget? What about the costs of additional sick time? So I'm sorry, I sort of inserted.
Can I just have a point of order here? I know that was a really long question, but mine is much more specific, and I just prefer that my question get answered before we move on to those long questions.
Okay, point taken, Trustee Higginson. So Secretary Treasurer, can you please respond to Trustee Higginson's question first? I thought the two were related. My bad.
So a couple things. First is the reason for the creation of the COVID response fund concept is so there are some pots of money available immediately, and everyone is aware that that's the case. We do anticipate that there's going to be extra dollars at the end of June. And one of the things that typically you wouldn't, or we wouldn't recommend as staff doing in a budget, is adding essentially continuing staff for a purpose that's not going to necessarily be continuing. So all of a sudden we'd put in, 10 additional support staff, and then next year we're coming to the board to say we're cutting 10 additional support staff because we don't need them anymore. Because the nature of COVID and is hopefully, and maybe it's not, but a one-time impact. That's why we feel having some preparation in the current budget to be able to spend, but then being able to be responsive by coming to the board in September with additional asks when we know some of the needs that are there, I think is the reasoning. So at this point, we've been very successful with being able to reallocate staff to help out in different ways. So if we're in this stage at some point next year, we probably would rely on that. So the difficulty of budgeting much more is because we don't have those knowns. So I think the intention, and the superintendent's going to correct me very quickly, is that we would come in September and say, okay, now we really have a good idea of the full costs. Here's $2 million surplus that we found from lack of spending next year. We need to make sure $500,000 of that is available for that purpose. So I think that is the thinking. And if we were incorrect, we would probably come back to the board in July or August and say, no, we need to access some more surplus because these costs are more than we thought they were.
Trustee Higginson, did you have a follow-up?
Thank you. That was my follow-up, so I won't follow up my follow-up. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, though.
Appreciate that. Thanks. So I've already read Trustee Keller's question out. Mark, did you need me to reread that? And we'll give Trustee Keller an opportunity to follow up as well if there's some points that are missed.
So I think that it's probably the superintendent's response, given that we're starting to get some guidance, or we expect more guidance provincially. So perhaps I can turn it over to the superintendent.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, there are a number of questions here. And as Secretary Treasurer Walsh mentioned, we are to get some more guidance by the end of the week from the ministry. And we're hoping to get more specific guidance around, you mentioned buses, Trustee Keller. The assumption is that we will have to install plexiglass. The assumption is that we will have to social distance on the buses. I'm not sure what that looks like. Perhaps it's one child per seat. PPE for staff. What we're hearing is that while staff can bring their personal protective equipment, we won't be supplying it. We'll have enough in case there's a child or an adult who's sick, but we're hearing from the provincial health office that PPE really protects the rest of the people from the person wearing the PPE. So in a school setting, it's I was going to say not appropriate, but it doesn't work like it would in a medical situation. So these and many other questions you've asked, good questions, and we're contemplating all of them, but we're really unsure of the answers as of yet, and we're hoping to be able to have some direction soon. Thank you.
Any follow-up, Trustee Keller?
If that's okay. So thank you, Superintendent Saywell. I think, as we can all appreciate, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And I think from a budget perspective, would it be safe to assume that when more information is available, and maybe we'll get some more at the end of the week, as you had mentioned, that we would develop some kind of a plan with some numbers? Is that reasonable?
I think as a district and other districts, we're kind of hoping for some specifics around these issues, really because it makes it easier for us. We don't have to do it locally, and then we're not in line with what other districts are doing. And so that is the hope. I know there will be some elements of the plan, the restart plan, that will be left to districts because, of course, we may have a different context than, the Island District maybe have a different context than other districts, as an example. Yeah, to answer the question, we're hoping, but we're just really unsure at this point.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see there's a comment by Trustee McKay. Trustee McKay.
Thank you. Sorry, sometimes I have to click two buttons. It takes me a minute. I guess I kind of want to pull, my suggestion is that we pull this conversation back to our overall budget rather than getting into too much of the nitty-gritty detail. I think what's important for the board to look at from an oversight perspective is, our staff are going to come to us and report out that they're going to spend X number of dollars on various items to support the COVID response. And I think what we need to be sure that we're doing from our oversight perspective is ensuring that we have some funds available and reassessing that on an ongoing basis based on what we need in the moment. And as long as from a budgetary perspective, we're setting aside some funds for that, staff can come back and report out to us on how those funds are spent as we go. But for right now, I'd like to pull us back to the bigger budgetary picture and sort of move us along, because I think a lot of these questions are going to come up as we go, and we're going to have them all the time. But I do hope that we can get back to the budgetary pages to finish the presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Trustee McKay, and had it not been for your comment, I was about to do the same, just being sort of mindful of the time here and that we still have quite a bit of the presentation left. So I'm going to hand it back to the Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm gonna, if there's questions on these are basically summaries of what we've talked about on pages 37 and 38, and it gives you a good sense. I always like to look at the expense by category to make sure that the most of that's on teachers. So it gives you a good sense of where we're at. So bring you to page 39. And prior to getting into this, I'd just like to bring to your attention one correction. Under teacher note, it says enrollment change 6.512. that should say 5.512. So that's the number of increase. And then under coordinator reduction, it should be 3 FTE. So the numbers are the same, the negative 719 in operating, but there's just a slight difference there. You'll see we've talked about the EAs, we've talked about some of these others. You will see that there's a proposal for a director of instruction position, and you'll see that there is a decline in coordinator positions, and perhaps I could turn it over to Deputy Superintendent Davey to review the rationale.
Good. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer, and through the chair. The rationale, what we're looking at, as noted, is a reduction of 3 coordinator positions through operating funds. One of those positions is, as mentioned previously, a literacy coordinator position. This would take us from 6 positions to 5. The rationale behind that, as noted, is to support literacy training for classroom teachers. So again, direct support to teachers in the form of release time, and moving us back to a model that we had previously, where we have in-service for teachers that are offered particularly in the area of literacy, but also with numeracy supports there as well. Second area where we're looking at reduction of coordinators. This is 2 coordinator positions, learning coordinators. So we would be going from 9 positions to 7 positions. And the rationale behind that is that we are looking as well to have an addition of a director of instruction for the learning agenda added to the work that we're doing, and this would be ensure alignment of the work of coordinators to support the goals as laid out in the board's strategic plan, and also the superintendent's operational plan, focusing on our objectives and actions. And this position would then directly work with and supervise the district coordinators. If I may, that's speaking to those 3 positions through operating. I'd like to expand upon this briefly if I can. We're also looking to add through our French federal funds to add a coordinator position. So that would actually take us then in terms of the French supports and take our coordinators overall from, again, the noted 9 positions and increase us to 8. So we would be looking at a reduction overall of 1 just out of a different fund there. Also within this, we are looking, and I'm just noting through the Department of Learning Services here, we're looking at a reduction of 1 Aboriginal education coordinator, moving from 2 coordinators to 1, and the emphasis there is that we would be looking to add a additional Halkamenim language teacher, so we would be increasing from 5 language teachers to 6. In addition to this, we are looking to add an inclusion support coordinator, moving from 3 inclusion support coordinators to 4. This would be an overall increase, or at present, sorry, we have an over allocation of counselor ratio, and we would be looking to make an adjustment for our counselor allocation in the 2020-2021 school year, and reallocating this FTE to inclusion support, the inclusion support coordinator role, and spreading the focus then of the inclusion support coordinators to include work on trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, and compassionate learning communities, the implementation in those areas. Again, through the chair, I'm happy to address any questions or turn it back over to the Secretary Treasurer if there are other comments to be made there.
Okay, I see there is a question from Trustee Barron. How are the learning coordinators currently overseen? How would this new Director of Instruction proposed position differ from what we currently have in place? Please clarify.
Okay. Again, through the chair, I'm happy to address the question, and if others see fit to add on to my response, I would appreciate that as well. The coordinators are presently overseen by our assistant superintendents, both elementary and secondary. What I will note there is that, again, our assistant superintendent at elementary does oversee 24 schools presently. In addition to that, she is being asked to so Assistant Superintendent Tate is overseeing these coordinators and the learning agenda for the district. And in addition, as noted, the Secretary Treasurer, the Assistant Superintendent for secondary is overseeing 6 secondary schools, 3 additional programs, including 4 additional programs, including CTC, ISE, so international students, our French programs, and Island Connect Ed, as well as learning alternatives. And within the French programs, our 4 French feeder schools are also overseen by the Assistant Superintendent for secondary programs. So really what we're looking at is a support to oversee the work of the coordinators, to supervise that group and to work directly with that group in our response to moving the learning agenda forward.
Okay, thank you. I have, I'm going to invite Trustee Keller to ask a question and comment.
Yes, thank you, Chair O'Neill. So when I heard the presentation and the proposal to add, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you said Director of Instruction. If you can please confirm that to Deputy Superintendent Davey. Yes, through the chair, Trustee Keller, that is correct. Right, and as well, I believe there were some coordinator positions, and I guess my question was, are the positions that are being proposed to be added exempt positions? And then I have a follow-up. Okay, again, through the chair, the coordinator positions are not exempt positions, they are teaching positions. And the Director of Instruction position focusing on the learning agenda supports would be an exempt position. Okay, thank you. I'm just have some concern. I'm being a little bit mindful of the feedback that we received through our thought exchange, and adding more exempt positions was not something that our feedback indicated was what people or the community wanted to see. So I thought I'd share that concern.
Okay, noted. So shall I hand it back to the Secretary Treasurer then to continue on with the report, or Deputy Superintendent Davies, did you have more to add on this presentation?
Thank you, Chair. No further updates at this point unless there are additional questions. Thank you.
I don't see any, so thank you. And over to you, Secretary Treasurer.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. So again, as noted earlier, we talked about the projected decline in the number of children with special needs designations, and so and how that would directly impact educational assistant staffing. And so that you see there in the negative 7.423. Students come back, jobs come back. This is a fairly regular occurrence. And then you'll see a couple of other minor changes. When you look at the special purpose funds, though, you will have to take a pen to the EA note based off of what we indicated that staff would actually be recommending is going to be changing from what you see in this presentation. So you can strike out 2 school food program planners removed, 1 community school coordinator removed, and then that would be altering the education assistant number to equal those positions. So the grand total of the changes, which are, or the proposed changes, which are largely enrollment driven, are there again with the asterisks next to the education assistants because of what we would be coming back to change ever so slightly. Okay. So capital, we include it, but obviously we're relatively restricted in what we're able to actually control about what we're going to be proceeding with. So you'll just see that the capital and the total amounts, including reserves, etc., to fund the various projects that are approved and or about to be approved or hopefully be approved. In the project type line, you'll see the various types of programs the ministry funds. So we have seismic, we have SEP, so you'll see dust collectors there, HVAC upgrades. There's one example of an insurance loss, which we're still trying to figure out with Schools Protection at Franklin Street Gym, and then some childcare to be built in our capital budget overall. And then our local capital, if you just take a quick peek, you'll see where the local capital is expected to be spent. And so the Hammond Bay addition, the Wi-Fi upgrade, you'll see the funds that are there, and then there'd be additional adds to them, and the various other pots that are available to support district initiatives. And just to point out one thing, particularly with respect to technology, I think it's been asked a number of times about whether we have a sufficient technology to support the COVID response. So we've got some kids coming back, and we've got some kids that, if you're at a certain percentage of the week, do you get to keep your computer that we've lent you? So if that becomes an issue, we could be looking to the technology plan funds to help support our immediate response to that as well. So the reconciliation and budget bylaw would be there, and perhaps Director Sutton, do you have any comments about page 41 that you think are valuable?
Through the chair, thank you. I just wanted to provide this information as this will be reflected in the ministry documents. So just so the numbers are fresh in minds, and it's just reconciling the revenues presented earlier from both the operating special purpose as well as our usual capital amortization and expense that is part and parcel of this. Our transfer to local capital, our appropriation of surplus, and the surplus deficit there, of course, is just the differential between the amortization of deferred capital revenue and the amortization of our capital assets. As per usual, there is no deficit within our operating or special purpose budgets. They are balanced. And of course, our budget bylaw is just expenses, which are totaled there for you.
And now, when we get to pages 42 and on, I think it's probably important just to make a brief comment because I think that there's been some really great questions that have been asked of staff. Well, how is spending aligning? How is your proposed budget aligning with what the goals of the district is or are, as well as what about the feedback that we've been receiving as a board? And so what we've tried to do is kind of break out a number of those areas. Oh, sorry, there's a question.
Yeah. Trustee Higginson?
Thank you. I just, on the full budget reconciliation, the total of restricted surplus that you'd like to use to balance the budget. $1,122,445 relates to the international student ed funding, the current or the list of positions that you outlined, and then also the community schools coordinator and the 2 foods programs. Am I correct with that? I'm allowed to be wrong because I got lost.
Okay, no, not
Okay,
exactly. So the community school coordinator funds that we're suggesting, approximately half of that we are just suggesting to take from the contingency in Community Link. And then the other approximately $60,000 would come from what we're suggesting at this point would be the COVID response fund. So there wouldn't be any change to the budget in that respect. Then the deficit associated with, I mean, because of the fact that exempt staff raises happen, the fact that principal staff or principal raises happen, general inflation that are not necessarily covered by the ministry, we do have a relatively small, whether international was in a deficit position or not, we'd still be looking at a way to mitigate some inflationary challenges as well. So I would say it's the inflationary challenges along with the international program and less the restricted surplus and less going to local capital for the technology plan. The positions talked about in learning services are cost neutral.
Can I just have a quick follow-up there, please? Yeah. Sorry, when you start talking about, raises and things like that, I get worried about the fact that we're looking at the possibility, when it's just the international student ed, the ISE stuff, it makes me feel like perhaps it's a one-off thing. But are we talking about being in a position of an ongoing structural deficit right now?
So, Director Sutton, I'm going to bring you in on that one.
With every year, we have to shift and change our expenditures to accommodate the increases for QB, NDTA, exempt, just general inflation, all of that. So we were able to balance all of that within our budget. The 1.122445 is the exact amount of the differential between the revenue and the expenditures that we left in place for the ISE program. So specifically for ISE, had we not had some of the expenses, there might have been less need, but at the end of the day, those expenses are ongoing and ministry provides funding for them. So this particular appropriation is specific to ISE.
And to follow up, so when you look at the reduction in the transfer from operating funds to local capital, that largely covers the difference for inflationary pressures.
Okay, we have another question from Trustee Stanley as well. I'll invite Trustee Stanley to ask your question.
Thank you. So this has kind of been like a niggling thought when we were talking about the international students. And so this is, I'm going to put it out there perhaps as an ask for more information at a later time. But I guess I just want to say I'm less optimistic about the long-term perspective of our international students and the kind of like the viability of the program. And the reasons why is because, what I want more information from is the considerations of the following. So there are factors like the length of the pandemic, which are yet to be unknown. Factors of associated economic downturn, which is yet to be known. We know that climate change models predict increasing vector-borne diseases like COVID, so we might be seeing these things more frequently. So there's a number of factors in my mind that are kind of out there that may undermine the viability from a long-term perspective about international students. And And so with regards to this budget and our decisions made, I'm wanting to perhaps, not right now, but at a later point in time, can we get a better understanding about your confidence levels, I guess, or how you got there, considering those things, given that we're at the point in time proposing to fund it or continue funding it in a deficit situation. I hope that makes sense. So I'm not asking for that now, but I'm just kind of wanting to learn a little bit more about why you have more confidence, because I'm feeling less confident.
So again, we can say why we're confident in the number that we're proposing, which is a very bleak number, that of 67, just because we know how many students have paid and how many have are still here in Canada. With respect to the future, I understand the question to be, what is the evidence that we believe that's showing that international students are going to continue to come? And I think that anecdotally, we continue to have, and we hear around the island, incredible amounts of interest of international students to still come to Canada. And I think particularly maybe in January is their idea. So, but we will take that away to actually get some more specific facts about what we're seeing and why we're making that assumption. Karen, could you add that to the list?
Thank you. And Mark, I'm just, I'm sorry, I'm ever mindful of the time here. We're meant to adjourn at 9 o'clock. So without sort of a motion to extend, I'm also mindful we have some other items on the agenda. We'll be having further discussion on this, and that there may also be some questions from the public as well. So I just wanted to put that out there. We've got a lot of questions, and just again, mindful of the time here.
Sure. So I'll just briefly say that you'll see where the direct connection of spending to goals is on the next number of pages. And I know that the question is asked, well, how are you connecting, you know, what is leading you to suggest to propose this spending for this purpose? And you'll see where those connections are being made. And what we anticipate is in the weeks and months and then years even to follow is continued questioning about, well, does that program actually support that as well as it could? Like, that's really important questions to be asked of staff. I just come back to Trustee Berzevich's question, and if you go to page 44, the direct connection to greenhouse gas emissions and where you'll find the various programs in the budget. There's a few more that you would be able to note. For instance, even the demolition proposals will impact our GHG emissions by not needing to heat buildings, those types of things. But you'll see that on page 44. And then you'll also see it when we come to the board in June to make our capital plan request to the Ministry of Education, which will include further funding. Finally, stakeholder budget consultation on page 45. We just wanted to briefly touch on, we think that what the students are asking for this budget and this direction of the board for a number of years is very, very aligned. With respect to the question about, well, you know, we have a lot of people in our public asking for lower class sizes and those types of supports. I mean, there's just two things I think I'd briefly say is, one, it would be interesting to see what the impact on our CEF might be if we just determined to decrease class sizes. Like, does the ministry react and say, well, you had money the whole time in your operating budget, why didn't you do that? Why did you need CEF? So could that be a self-defeating proposition? I'm not so sure, but it's something to think about. And the other thing is, and I know or Deputy Superintendent Davey talked about, I think it's worth talking some more about, is that here's these changes we're proposing and here's the educational basis to do it and how it supports the strategic plan. And so really looking forward to more questions about that as we move, about why these proposals do match the strategic plan. So that is the proposed budget, with, I note the little asterisks about the changes that we're going to make to propose to you, and subject to questions, look forward to many discussions over the next coming weeks.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just pulling up here. Trustee McKay, under Truth and Reconciliation, can we please change the job title to reflect the Hulkaminum name with the manager? Truth and Reconciliation in brackets, maybe. It's a small but meaningful change. Thank you for flagging that, Trustee McKay.
Director Sutton, if you could take that note for when we come back.
Well, I see no additional questions. Oh, there we go. I was speaking too soon. Trustee Stanley, followed by Trustee Keller, have questions.
Hi, thank you.
For the Secretary Treasurer.
I actually have a lot of questions about board goals and how they're being manifested. But rather than, ask them individually, I'm just going to kind of get to the point because at a time, and so forgive me for being blunt. But besides my own passion about the environmental aspect, that was one of the ones that students and staff got behind and got excited perhaps the most, or at least it was one of that really generated a lot of passion and excitement from our learning community. When I look at the proposed kind of what objectives it is that we're meeting, or what perhaps the actions are to meet those, to be blunt, I'm really disappointed. But I need to learn more. I don't necessarily understand what is new. So I would like to better understand, what is it that we've implemented to be environmental leaders? Reading it feels a little bit like a lot of the stuff that we're already doing, and we kind of put it under that category. And my worry is that we're going to disappoint all those people that were excited and ready to jump on board for this goal, and undermine that kind of movement or forward movement because of their excitement. So maybe there's lots of innovation in this and I'm not aware of it. Maybe there's lots of new implementation, but it's not obvious to me. So I'm wondering if you could, perhaps we could get some explanation about how these are, new implementations or innovative ideas that are going to kind of help us reach that goal of being an environmental leader.
Through you, Madam Chair. So thank you very much. And this is the exact type of question that I'm hoping to be asked many times, particularly with respect to the operations side. So as you can see, the budget is, is intended to be as stable as reasonably possible, and that is the basis of the budget. To be clear, to be absolutely frank, you're not seeing huge investments here in that area, particularly from an operational perspective, with the caveat that we will certainly be coming to the board in June with a whole bunch of environmental projects that we're going to ask the ministry just for support that we hope the community can get behind. So they're not reflected in that, and there'll be some relatively biggies on that front. Perhaps I can turn it over to the superintendent with respect to the education side of things, but given the time, and also just note that given the environmental policies are on their way, that's hopefully going to drive some change as well. But just want to acknowledge your point that you don't see a great deal of difference in the operational aspect from year to year on that particular point.
Yeah, thank you through the chair. Thanks for the question. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of what do we have? 19 objectives, 32 action themes, 95 action plans, and of course the 4 broad goals of the district. That is really our sort of what guides us in our work. The budget doesn't allow for spending a whole lot in those areas, except to say that we are changing the thinking of teachers in the classroom, staff, support staff, exempt staff around what we're focusing on. The idea of having some leadership through our learning services coordinators is a good idea to focus that work. We will perhaps have more opportunity in September to resource our goals in a better way, but as you know, 90% of our money goes towards staffing, and we have challenges in that regard as well. So I think you will see more as we get into next September, and as well as some of the things that the Secretary Treasurer is thinking about in June as well. There might be elements of this that Deputy Superintendent Tim Davey would like to speak to as well.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Again, through the chair. In terms of the proposed changes, again, just emphasize that the intention of the Department of Learning Services is to further align ourselves in terms of our staffing and resources to the goals of the board, and also the objectives of the superintendent's operational plan has been discussed by the superintendent. So really, proposed changes that we're bringing forward are really to move our agenda forward in support of the goals of the board. Thank you.
Okay, we have Trustee Keller with a question as well. Trustee Keller, I'll invite you to ask your question.
Thank you, through the chair. So throughout the year, the boards has identified a number of items for discussion as part of our budget process. And I don't have a complete list before me. And as far as I know, there may only be one motion related to these items. The ones I recall were things including snow removal on sidewalks, and we had a presentation on that, but there were some budget considerations that needed to be discussed. AEDs, or automatic defibrillators. There was a presentation from a group, if I remember correctly, about textbooks and learning resources, signage at Dover Bay, and those are items that are kind of hanging out there that I thought we would have had a discussion on. Perhaps they have been included in the draft budget, but in any case, is it possible to request that, this is my question, that we have discussions on these items, any that I'm missing, at some point in time that would provide the board with an opportunity to discuss them and make some decisions?
Through the chair, well, my suggestion is, I think quite simply as a matter of process, a trustee could bring any of those items forward for discussion. If there was more information that was required on any of one of those topics you mentioned, then we could bring something forward there as well.
And if I could just add to the superintendent's comments, Chair, that in June, we will have the AED report pursuant to the board motion. And it's the exact type of item that as staff, we would recommend that if the board was going to be looking to support such a program, that the one-time expenditure associated with it would be very much appropriate to be discussed when the September numbers come in, but the AED numbers will be there as well.
Okay, I don't. Trustee Keller, was there a follow-up?
No, I appreciate the response. So I suppose that if I'm hearing Superintendent Saywell correctly, I would need to bring forward a motion to request that we discuss these items.
That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any further comments or questions. I do know I want to thank the Secretary Treasurer for not presenting on just one area, but 3 this evening. And I know that these conversations will continue. In fact, next week as well. Oh, sorry, was remiss. Trustee Higginson.
You know what? That's okay. I'll pass. I'll just continue my comments with our meetings next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Chair, could I just say one last thing?
Sure.
Well, two last things. One, I just wanted to state that I called on Mr. Hackwood earlier because I saw his name at the top, but I'd actually given the team the evening off. So he wasn't expected to be here. That was just, I saw his name, and so that's why I called him out. So that's on me.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That's very courteous.
And the second thing is I just really want to recognize Director Sutton and the work and heart and soul she's put into this this budget, preparing everything, and how nimble she's going to be over the next few weeks and getting information and making changes as required. So this is amazing work she's done.
Okay, so thank you to all. We'll move along the agenda. There is we do not have any correspondence as per item 9 on the agenda to be referred. There is no unfinished business, no new business. However, agenda item number 12, for information, the NDTA Professional Development Report. So thank you to the NDTA for your report. And looking forward to further presentations as early as next week. I am, just looking, no questions this evening coming from anyone who's joined us. So I will now be seeking a motion to adjourn. That's been moved by Trustee Stanley and seconded by Trustee McKay. Chair McKay, I never know. Thank you again to all. There's a number of thank yous coming from Trustee Brezovich, Trustee McKay, thanking Tanya and others for their work. So with that, enjoy the rest of your evening. Oh, do I have to call the vote, I guess, eh? Second.